So, good evening and welcome to Dusty Feet. It's February 6th, 2023, and we are continuing our series on how to view the Bible. This is part 4. And we're using the videos from the Bible Project as our launch point. So, we can continue from there and we'll see where it takes us. Outside the class, it's a bit different. We expect you to watch the reference material before we start chatting about it. It's kind of like homework. I link all of the material for each week in advance on TheDustyFeet.com on the Outside the Class page. Those videos premiere every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. Don't forget to subscribe. Click that bell icon if you want a reminder. And as always in the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more branches on the vine with the Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. So each week we're going to start with addressing these expectations, right? One, this is not a definitive "you shall do this." It is hopefully a way one might opt to look at things, right? Two, this is a series, so there will be no one-line answers, actually many episodes with different responses and different options. Three, please give grace as each person learns about this wonderful collection of scrolls. Yeah. Four, again, this will be a series that builds on itself, so there is an expectation that one would have listened to the previous episodes to keep things in context. And five, through this series, I will probably have a few points where we have differing opinion from Tim and John. Yeah. By no means am I saying that they are wrong, just that I have a differing view on some things. Because I have nothing but the highest honor and respect for these two and the work that they do at the Bible Project. Yeah, agreed? Okay, I also want to remind y'all of the new podcast from Rabbi David Foreman and the folks at Aleph Beta, right? Again, a book like no other. Because he too is reminding his audience that these are important elements to really grasp in Torah. Man, I'm not really surprised at all. But for those that are interested in this new podcast from the rabbi and using the Torah as its own commentary, again, here's the intro.
Hey folks, this is Rabbi David Foreman. I am the lead scholar at Aleph Beta, and I want to tell you about a new podcast that I am pioneering, a book like no other. The book in question, of course, is the Bible itself. It's a core text of our religion, a core text of Western civilization, but what makes it different than every other book I've ever read is that layered into the book itself is the Bible's own commentary on the meaning of its words. This meta-commentary, it's everywhere in the Torah. It's a constant, profound weave that permeates virtually everything the Torah says. And once you begin to see it, it's breathtaking. The notion that the Bible has this special quality, that's the underlying assumption that's really the bedrock of my work. I'm looking to share the fruits of that conviction with you in this podcast. We'll be reading the Torah on its own terms. We'll be following its lead. In this endeavor, I'll be joined by Aleph Beta CEO and my dear friend Imu Shalev. He's going to be my chavrusa, my learning partner, and also your narrator through this journey. When we head down some rabbit holes, dear Imu will be there to pull you out again because, frankly, dear friend, we've left the seams in these conversations right there for you to see. And that, by the way, is intentional. I'm looking to actually take you into my own research process. I'm allowing you to kind of peek in, to listen in to unscripted conversations where ideas bubble up to the surface in surprising, unexpected ways. In this podcast, dear listener, you'll need to buckle up because you're coming along for what's sure to be a wild ride. Don't take my word for it. Listen to the podcast. Come along for the journey. Open up the book for yourself and fall in love with it all over again. It really is a book like no other.
So that is on multiple podcast platforms. The link is in the description. I hope you enjoy it because I know I have been. Yeah. Okay. So now let's continue our journey with the next video. It's Jewish meditation literature by the folks at the Bible Project. So enjoy this.
So the Bible is a collection of books written in different literary styles like narrative, poetry, and prose. And most of us are familiar with these kinds of literature.
Yeah, we all know a narrative when we see one, like The Hunger Games or The Great Gatsby.
And most people can recognize poetry, whether it's Walt Whitman or the songs of Bob Dylan.
And every day we're surrounded by prose and news articles or essays.
Now all of these examples are modern American literature in that they came from this time period and this region of the world.
But there's also medieval English literature from another place in time, or ancient Greek writings from this place in time.
So each time period and culture produces its own unique kind of literature.
And in order to read the Bible well, we need to keep in mind that it comes from this part of the world and was produced in this basic period of time.
So what's unique about ancient Jewish literature?
Well, a key feature is that it lacks a lot of the details that modern readers have come to expect in stories and poems.
And this makes it seem really simple.
But actually, it's very sophisticated literature. Every detail that is given matters.
And that's great, but the lack of detail means that stories are often loaded with ambiguities. I mean, take one of the first stories, Adam and Eve in the garden. Where did this talking snake come from? And why did God allow him there? Why didn't Adam and Eve die on the spot like God said they would? And who's this offspring of the woman who will destroy the snake but is bitten by it?
Yeah, so many puzzles in this story. And some of these are questions that we have and that are not important to what the author is focusing on. But some of these ambiguities are intentional.
Intentional? Won't that lead to bad interpretations, people filling in the gaps with their own answers?
Well, that's a risk the biblical authors took in writing this way. We all tend to impose our own cultural assumptions onto the Bible, but they apparently thought the risk was worth it. These oddities are really invitations into an adventure of reading and discovery.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, the strange promise about the offspring of the woman crushing and being bitten by the snake. That word offspring is a clue to pay attention to genealogies, which, lo and behold, run all through the biblical narrative. They trace the lineage from Eve all the way to King David and his offspring. And in the New Testament, Jesus is connected to the offspring of this royal line. Now, when you read the prophets, Isaiah connected this king to the suffering servant who would die on behalf of his people. And then, in the book of Revelation, there's this symbolic vision. And can you guess? It's about a woman and her offspring. It's Jesus and his followers who conquer the dragon by giving up their lives.
Yeah, so each part of the story there is loaded with ambiguities, but altogether, it makes sense.
And this is the literary genius of the Bible. It forces you to keep reading and then interpret each part in light of the others.
This is feeling complicated. I don't know if I can do all that.
Well, you're actually not expected to notice all of this by yourself or all at once. This dense way of writing forces you to slow down and then read carefully, embarking on this interactive discovery process through the whole biblical narrative over a lifetime of reading and rereading.
Ah, okay. Meditation literature.
Yeah, in Psalm 1, we read about the ideal Bible reader. It's someone who meditates on the scriptures day and night. In Hebrew, the word meditate means literally to mutter or speak quietly. The idea is that every day for the rest of your life, you slowly, quietly read the Bible out loud to yourself, and then go talk about it with your friends, pondering the puzzles, making connections, and discovering what it all means. And as you let the Bible interpret itself, something remarkable happens. The Bible starts to read you. Because ultimately, the writers of the Bible want you to adopt this story as your story.
So, this ancient Jewish writing style, it must create unique types of narrative and poetry and discourse.
Yes, and we'll explore all of those literary styles starting next with biblical narrative.
So, Jewish meditation literature. Did you initially view the scriptures as this? As we've been building on with the previous videos, that we did identify the three main literary styles in with narrative, poetry, and prose discourse, right? Yet, with those three styles, they are still set within a greater context as ancient Jewish literature or Jewish meditation literature. I'd be willing to bet that even with medieval English literature, right, that we would still struggle with the original language and many of the cultural contexts. But now we have an older or ancient texts that are not just hundreds of years old, like even Shakespeare, for instance, that's over 400 years old and it's English based. Okay. But this now is a Mesopotamian culture that is thousands of years old. Exodus is set nearly 3,300 years in our past. So it is a culture that it's vastly separated from us. Its history, its customs, its traditions, they are extremely foreign to us. Yeah. Let's take a side note real quick. The majority of scripture translations that we use today are from the Septuagint and or those found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, yeah, for pieces. But those translations themselves are thousands of years later. But here's an interesting point to consider. The oldest fragments that we have of scripture, right, actually use symbols. Um, we call them like pictographs. A more modern term, loose way would be emoticons. Yeah, we're going backwards. Yes, but these are symbols that mean something itself, and then when it's combined or grouped with others, that begins to bring definition, and then from that a story emerges. Right. So here's a peek at a bit of that pictograph progression. I got this graphic from Jeff Benner and with him at the Ancient Hebrew Research Center. Okay, and link to this is in the description below for you to see. So what we have is that this is just a piece of it, and if you look on the left, it has ancient Semitic Hebrew, then it goes to modern Hebrew and Greek and Latin. But if you look in the far left corner with early, you'll notice those are pictures. And then you go to the um, fifth column over where it says picture, and it'll tell you what the description is. Ox head, tent floor plan, foot, door, man with arms raised, tent peg, a mattock, uh, tent wall, or basket. Yeah. Then it tells you the meanings that have been used. And so you get those. Then you'll get the sound that goes with it. That's interesting because it's a sound that we've assigned to it today. It sounds interesting to think, but Hebrew for a while faded away and then it came back. And as we notice that things have gone through time, that things change. It's use the facts. England, for instance, has accents, and when they get over here, that accent eventually goes away with time and history. So it's interesting that they pick the sounds, but we'll go with it from there. But then we go to the modern Hebrew, and we go to Greek, and we go to Latin. But notice it started as a picture, which already itself is a little bit of a story. Put the story little pieces together and it becomes something. But we just have it as A, for instance, with the ox head. And you go, it's the Aleph, it's the beginning, but A is not a story. The ox head, very different. Interesting. Something to ponder. So when it's discussed as Jewish meditation literature, we still need to remember that these roots are at a time that we can only dream of that, right? But within that added context of language, um, so we have another layer to address that. But that might also shed some light on a comment that John made about details that are lacking in Scripture. If the original script or the language we were using were pictographs to pass on information, it's to me it's rather apparent as to why the lack of detail at times, because the language itself lacked detail. The purpose was for the one who could interpret the characters to be able to tell a story, to pass it on. It inherently lacked the detail that the storyteller would bring out and fill in. Does that bother you? Interesting. Because we are of course very much about proper English, exact texts, right? Yet the ancient storytellers that passed on the lineages and the information for their history, they lack the details given them. Yes, this is ancient Jewish meditation literature. So it's hard to ignore that once you're aware of it. So Tim mentioned something that caused me to pause a bit. He says that the biblical authors wrote it this way, knowing the risks. When has an author in history, especially ancient history, chose to communicate with an unknown audience at an unknown time? Yes, we have God involved in stories written by men about the times that they were in and the important stories that needed to be passed on, and passed on especially to who? To later generations. So we are not writing for an unknown culture and time, yet they do create and develop connections in this scripture that will cause us to link and connect the stories and that information over time. So they gave a great example of the offspring of the woman crushing the head of the snake, right? And that was to pay attention to lineage, right? And that winds its way all through the scriptures, with it culminating in the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke. So more of that prose discourse that was probably rather boring at first blush, when it really is rather important. So I don't think that's not writing to an unknown culture and time. It's still passing on information that was deemed important by the author and the community for as long as the story was told. Because the context is still in the audience. They had to understand the stories. Because who passes on something that they don't connect with, right? Like they said, but the purpose is to keep listening. That would be reading for us, so that the story, it continues to develop. Yeah? So, because remember, here at the Dusty Feet, we have been developing the idea that, of course, we're still in the biblical narrative. So we have this Jewish meditation literature, but now we use it to direct our story and the direction that we had in our part of the story. Because along with John, remember that he brought up the point that there are ambiguities in these details that can, or lack of details that can confuse us. So we've been talking about this on Outside the Class, about one of the key points that Jesus made about parables, right? Uh, Telling a meaning with the analogy of a story. And that that's the lingering crowd, were not going to get it the first time, right? So in that vein, I'm more and more compelled that we might not understand scripture the first time around either. Probably not the first few times. Yeah. But Tim mentions that the biblical authors were willing to take the risk to write it the way they did, right? And I'm not compelled by that position either. The biblical authors had an intended group, and they were communicating to or with them, right? Uh, but I will say that in trying to understand the communication and the context of Scripture as it is, as Tim put it is still an adventure into reading and discovery within the context of the culture that's there. It's kind of funny the way Tim put it. It even has um, a current cultural context twist, right? Because the original audience was a listening audience, right? Theirs was to hear the story, then maybe talk amongst themselves and see what others saw. Because maybe it's a more nuanced question, maybe to ask, what did you hear? And what are you thinking about now? Or how do you feel about that? I wonder how much of each story, when they were told or read to, right, was it in snippets like we like to do? Or maybe was it, say, the whole story to ponder its entirety, right? Okay, so is it a fair question? Maybe it is, maybe not. Um, but even with all the scripture and such, do we really get things, really understand things when we only read in snippets? Hmm, interesting. So Tim made a point about the suffering servant part of the Messiah, right? That Messiah Ben Joseph role. So did you or I see that in the times that we've read scripture? Or did we see the Messiah that was to come and liberate? Because it was the expectation of their time for sure. Um, I know it is honestly impossible to remove all of the New Testament understanding that we have as we gain this understanding of the Jewish meditation literature and and really grasp how they saw their stories and the expectations from them in the direction that they're living, right? Because they did not have the the New Testament. They only had the stories that they heard at the time that they were alive, either during the Old Testament or even during the apostolic writings. They did not have what we call the New Testament. They still only had the Tanakh and the stories that they heard while they were alive in their time. The scrolls written after told the story to following generations. Yes? To be honest, as well, in that we were told things about Jewish culture that have been, frankly, inaccurate to be nice and unfair to be more truthful, um, because it does create a bias on how things can be viewed going forward. Yeah, because here in the Dusty Feet and on Outside Class, we believe that this narrative is continuing with us. Remember that these folks that we're reading about in this amazing, fantastic Jewish meditation literature They're living in the moment that we're reading or hearing about, right? They're actually in it. And there's something Tim and John said that it is the entirety of the story that will give the context to the interpretation and the understanding later. Okay? Okay, but can we imagine and really grasp putting ourselves in their sandals and only having the story that they have up to their moments as we're reading it? And with the storytellers and the teachers that they have, right? How are they to, at times, grasp things differently than them? Yeah. Like I constantly say, we are them and they are us. So I'll dabble a bit with the revelation to John to make a point. I'll make a point. So now we're in the exact same position that those in the Gospels were. We're in that gap between the last prophet. For them, it was Micah, right? For them. And for us, we're after our last prophet, John. And now, as them, we are waiting for the Messiah. We are them, they are us. So with our history as a guide, and the boys did say that the whole picture will help us see, and we're not at the end. What are the chances that we just might not see it as we think? We're so quick to have a problem with their thinking and yet not willing to put the mirror on ourselves. I know that keeps me humble when that context is over, um, and we lay it on top of the story. It's overlaid on the story. Yeah. But yet I'm also encouraged uh, because, to be truthful, we do have more than they had. Uh, and we've lived in a time with more of the story told. Yeah. And like Tim and John shared, it invites us in to this lifetime of an interactive process of reading and rereading these scrolls. Again, yeah, I'll admit that I'm humbled by living in this time. Um, where we, unlike the folks who we're reading about in Scripture in their stories, we actually have our own copies of this Jewish meditation literature. Yeah, we call it the Bible, and we can read it daily. I think the explanation that Tim gave for meditation literature was more telling than at first pass as well, and that it was meant to be uttered, muttered right under your breath. Of course, today we call that talking to ourselves. Yeah. So I'll share a story. And in my life's past, I was a bit of a drama geek, as I liked acting as a child. Grew up in California, Hollywood, all that fun stuff, right? So my goal was to learn and rehearse lines that were to be repeated in front of others to tell a story. And as I practiced, I did an awful lot of muttering. It was an important part for me so that I could help tell the story that I was hoping to share with others. So I wonder if at times that kind of thought might creep back into our lives. And maybe that thought of taking a step backwards, and maybe those folks with muttering, maybe they had something. Because it seems that the folks at the Bible Project and at Aleph Beta, they're on a similar journey, as both have put it, using the scriptures to explain itself, to be its own commentary. So, let the muttering begin. Yeah? And I hope that this helps us to continue to refresh our how to view the Bible. Yeah. So on our next How to View the Bible episode, we'll begin our journey with how to read biblical narrative. That ought to be interesting. That ought to be fun. Okay, a point to ponder to close the day. And this is again a lighthearted one. I thought this was cute. Just seemed it hit me. And this is a pastor slide up there, and it's the General Pauline letter outline. Grace, I thank God for you. Hold fast to the gospel. For the love of everything holy, stop being stupid. Timothy says hi. Made me chuckle. Interesting for Paul. And thanks for with us tonight on the Dusty Feet. Interesting. And our file left. So